consensus, which was an absolute disaster for Latin America in general, and Ecuador in particular. And Ecuador had its own financial crisis 15 years ago with a devastating impact on people's living standards. And clearly that sounds very familiar to what we are currently experiencing here in the UK and indeed across Europe. But what Carrera did, as we know, championed state-led development model, challenged the neoliberal thinking, renegotiated external debt and increased social spending, brought in tax reforms to make sure that the super rich paid their fair share, to make sure that wealthy corporations were able to avoid their tax responsibilities. It all sounds very familiar, doesn't it, to the sort of things that we've been seeing in this country, with the super rich avoiding their taxes and these multinational corporations not paying, even though they're making these massive profits in the UK, not paying their taxes here. And Carrera's presided over considerable growth over the last 5 years. No recession, avoided a recession that virtually everywhere else in the world has gone through. Poverty's fallen by a third in the last 5 years. Extreme poverty's fallen by 45%. Investments in healthcare has been introduced. Education investment is doubling. And whilst we're actually forcing students to actually pay £9,000 a year in tuition fees and seeing working class people actually turning their back on education, university education in Ecuador has been made free, and that's resulting in participation rates going through the roof of some of the poorest people in Ecuador. Overcrowded housing has been halved in that period of time. It is a real inspiration to us in this country, and indeed I think right across the rest of Europe. And I think we can point to what Carrera and the Ecuadorian government has achieved as proof positive that there is an alternative way to this austerity which is causing so much damage to our people here in this country. We can all talk about, economic theory. Well, I can talk about, I'm a bricklayer, I talk about economic theory, but I'm actually just a kind of former bricklayer. But it just seems like common sense to me that if we invest in our people, if we use the power of the state to turn the economy around, if we make these multinational corporations and the super rich pay their way, we can put that income resource to good effect. And in my view, there is a symbiotic relationship between the public and private sectors. Both need each other. We need a strong private sector, yes, but we also need a strong public sector, because public services define the kind of society in which we live. They actually define a decent and a good society. But they also make a massive contribution to economic growth as well, because everybody that works in the public sector pays their taxes and they spend their money in the real economy. And all of the procurement that the public sector is responsible for goes to the private sector as well. So, we can learn many, many lessons. We can talk about economic theories, but we don't need to sort of, as it were, say, look, this is just a theory. We can look to what they're doing in Ecuador and say, look, there is an alternative way. Let's try that. Let's actually use the power of the state for good effect. Let's use the power of the state for the benefit of our people instead of the benefit of a tiny minority of very rich individuals who've done very well, thank you, since this coalition government has come to power. So the very best of luck to you, and I should be rooting obviously for Carrera, and I'm sure you'll get a great
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak here and for organising this excellent meeting. I agree with a lot that has been said so far, and I'll try not to repeat it too much. I do think it's especially welcome that we here in London and in Britain are having an event to broadcast what's happening in Ecuador, because we sadly passed through a period just last year and before, which exhibited the great ignorance of Latin America and of Ecuador on the part of the British government and the British media. I'm referring, of course, to the reaction to the quite normal diplomatic process of giving a haven to an individual, in this case the founder of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange. And you will remember that our Foreign Secretary, William Hague, actually declared that he was studying plans to enter the Ecuadorian consulate by force. This was an absolutely ridiculous as well as extremely provocative statement. It instantly won, if there'd been any doubt about this, the other Latin American states to support Ecuador, and it revealed great gross ignorance and maladroitness on the part of Hague. But really, in a way, what was worse is the way this affair was treated in the press. There was no attempt to really fully explain the Ecuadorian government's position. I was later in the interview with the president for New Left Review. I was able to confirm that the Ecuadorian government at all times had made it clear that if the Swedish prosecutors wanted to come and interview Assange, then the Ecuadorian consulate would make all the necessary arrangements for that to have, so that he wouldn't have to go to Sweden, he would be interviewed, as has happened with other people in similar situation. The Norwegian government, the Swedish government has been prepared to interview people in foreign embassies and consulates. And at this time, as I'm sure you'll remember, there was also an attempt to paint the government of Rafael Correa as a sort of tin pot dictatorship which had a stranglehold over the media and the newspapers and TV stations of Ecuador. A completely ludicrous portrait, quite apart from the fact that Correa has been repeatedly elected and I'm sure is on his way to re-election, despite the fact that also that if you go to Ecuador, you can easily see that most of the large privately owned newspapers, and most of them are privately owned, are quite hostile to the Correa government, and that goes for many of the leading TV stations as well. So there's a lot of information and education that has to be imparted to the British public, because we can't rely on our government and certainly not on our media to do this. And so I'm very pleased that we've got this, we've had this meeting here this evening. And I want to really repeat a point and underline a point that's been made by other speakers, namely that much is to be learned from the Ecuadorian experience, especially as a positive, constructive response to severe economic crisis and the malpractices of banks and of Wall Street and the so-called international community. Really, Ecuador in the late, in 15 years ago, a dozen years ago, was going through an experience that one might compare with Greece over the last 2 or 3 years. The same really dramatic attack on living standards, the same loss of morale and political disarray. And yet Ecuador, through its citizens' revolution, was able to pull itself together, and with Rafael Correa and his government's wise economic programs of stimulating investment, he was able to achieve, there was a 1-year dip in GDP, but then growth resumed at 5 or 6%, and unemployment has actually been reduced, and Ecuador is pulling through the crisis. And of course, Ecuador remains a poor country. Britain is a very much richer country, But there is this strong contrast between them, which is that whereas the previous speaker has just pointed out, poverty is increasing in Britain, it's actually been decreasing with the Gini coefficient going down by 12 points in Ecuador. And that has been part of the story of maintaining the growth in the Ecuadorian economy, maintaining demand. I hope you won't mind if I make a point, it may appear a little technical, I don't think it is a dryly technical point. But really, when you're faced with a terrible austerity crisis and a credit crunch, as the British economy and to a lesser extent the US economy still is, then the crucial point is not only in some indiscriminate way to boost demand. That's a view of a sort of simplified Keynesianism that I don't think Keynes himself recommended. It isn't a question of just going out and giving everybody money. That might help a little, funnily enough, and even some economists are now saying the solution is to helicopter loads of pound notes to the population. But really, it makes obvious sense to concentrate, well, first, not to give to the rich as well as to the poor. The rich won't be able to spend all that money. They've already got too much money. It's the poor who can be guaranteed to know how to spend that money. But also, it's the public element, and the previous speaker, I'm sort of trying to sort of follow on from some of the points he's making. I'm very pleased to see a Labour spokesman at this event, I should say. I do feel, however, that it would be rather a good idea to organise a trip to Ecuador for our shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and Hawks, because he's very good at denouncing, and he was quite brave actually to say that the austerity was wrong, and he did say it. But what he signally fails to do is to paint a positive picture of an economy transformed by public investment in needed services, in new industries, and that's really what I see as being an essential element of the Ecuadorian path, the path to recovery and to renewed growth. For example, the 3 universities about which we spoke. I mean, these are each meant to be major universities. They're meant to be at the highest quality and to eventually become world-class universities. We haven't heard anything as specific as that. Also in Ecuador, students do get free education, and that's again something that it would be nice to hear more about plans of that sort. So it's not just public sector putting resources there, it's making sure that they're invested in ways that raise employment, that promote social inequality, social equality, and that promote social development. Now, how has Ecuador been able to do this? Well, it's partly because governments actually do have a tremendous power to create resources through conferring and distributing credit. They can do that, they can encourage the growth of public banks and other investment vehicles, and that's actually what the Ecuadorian government has done. Of course, it's been helped by the fact that it's been raising more in taxation. How's it been doing that? Has it been raising tax rates? Well, actually, not very much. What it's been doing is collecting the taxes, and that's a very radical innovation for Ecuador. And indeed, not just for Ecuador, for many parts of the capitalist world, as we well know, with our, the likes of Starbucks and so forth in Britain. And I just have to tell you that the name of the man in charge of this program, as I understand it, is Carlos Marx. So raising tax, that's an important part of the process. Another thing is making sure that public savings are being carefully husbanded and are being invested to advantage, in particular pension funds, and that's been another source of capital for development and social development. which carries, of course, the full government guarantee that, for the beneficiaries of those funds. And that's really a modern type of 21st century socialist initiative, I think, which we see being carried out by the government of Ecuador. Ecuador, of course, and it's a point that's already been made, but it bears repeating, especially with examples like Greece to hand, and maybe tomorrow that's going to be Spain or Italy. Governments have the power to cancel debt. And one of the first initiatives of the Correa government, and one of the things he was associated with even at the time when he was finance minister before he became president, was the cancellation of odious debt. Odious debt being debt that's entered into as a result, in part or in whole, of, for example, corrupt practices with payoffs to the people who are negotiating or handling that debt, or extra political sort of pressure of one sort or another on the government. There can be things like, for example, in the case of Greece, it was getting huge loans from France, but only on condition that it bought large numbers of French Mirage fighters. And Ecuador also, when it carried out its audit of the debt that it suffered, was able to identify that about half of the debt was odious and could be repudiated on those grounds. So these are some other elements of the Ecuadorian approach to development. I think the Yasuni ITT proposal, which is in essence to say we've got this vast reserve around Yasuni National Park of oil, the largest reserve in Ecuador, and the Ecuadorian government still hasn't developed it and is willing to keep the oil in the ground if other richer states will participate in compensating them for this. Not in giving them the full value, or anything like the full value of the oil, but will be able to make a contribution to the maintenance of the rainforest in that way. And there's been some response from some quarters, but still nothing serious or large scale. Finally, I want to say that I think a critical element in the success of the Ecuadorian government has been, and this goes back to my first remarks, its ability to act independently and to challenge the influence of the United States, above all the traditional idea that Latin America is some sort of backyard to Washington DC and that it has some sort of special sacred role there. Actually, its role has often been to prop up extremely reactionary governments and actually the confrontation of Ecuador with the United States, its willingness, for example, not to attend meetings of inter-American bodies if they exclude Cuba. What is the grounds for excluding Cuba? Correa insisted, and I think the Ecuadorian government is helping to produce a big change in the policies, in fact, of all the other Latin American states. They've actually been one by one coming around to the Ecuadorian view, and I think the days of excluding Cuba are close to being over. So thank you once again.
Okay, well, thank you very much to the organisers for organising this very successful, if absolutely freezing cold, meeting. So if I say anything that doesn't sound quite logical, it may be a natural thing, or it may be that my brain's kind of frozen. But it's good to see so many people here tonight, and it's very, very good to hear the other speakers talking about this, and I'm very happy to be on the platform because I think that the issue of what is going on in Latin America is one which should be of concern to everybody in this country. It should be of concern because it seems that we have these meetings when there's an election, because every time there is an election there are all sorts of questions raised about possible intervention. And I think we should see the American intervention, and I guess that I'm on the platform because to talk about the outside enemy, the United States, and of course let's not forget its very loyal helper over here in London in the form of the British government. But we should remember that the American intervention, much of the time around the world, is a bit like the iceberg. It's kind of submerged a lot of the time. You have overt coups, you have wars, you have occupations, you have all those things going on, but a lot of the time it is the way in which pressure is put on governments, the pressure on opposition parties, the creation of opposition parties and movements in all sorts of parts of the world, which are there not to allow, as they always claim, the democratic process to take its course. Exactly the opposite, in fact. Democracy in most of the world isn't a good idea for the United States because it means governments which don't agree with the United States, and therefore it doesn't mind democracy if it can guarantee a government which is friendly to it, but it doesn't like it so much when you begin to see challenges, as we've seen in many different parts of the world. And I think that the danger of intervention therefore is something we always have to keep uppermost in our minds. And obviously people referred to the attempted coup 2 years ago. We know recently the constitutional coup in Paraguay. We know the situation in Honduras going back to 2009. And therefore, it's not a question that this is going to happen before Sunday. I'm sure that won't be the case. I'm sure that all the things that people say and hope about the election, I suspect, will come to pass. But it is constantly to be vigilant about what the outside intervention is about and why they want to do it. And of course, I suppose it's hard for us all to sort of think why the CIA and the American government could possibly want to intervene in any of these countries. So perhaps let's put forward a few ideas as to why they might. Firstly, on the international issues, Robin has referred to the granting by the Ecuadorian embassy in London of asylum to Julian Assange, something which was met with absolute outrage by William Hague. I mean, when we talk about Tin Pot, right, he's not a dictator, but I think Tin Pot minister, I suppose, fits the bill for him rather well. The kind of outrage, the fabricated outrage about that, and the response to it by the British press, by the British government, tells you how very upset they get when anybody challenges their dominance. And of course we should remember what WikiLeaks was about. WikiLeaks was about telling the truth about American interventions in many parts of the world, telling the truth about American soldiers who killed innocent people in Iraq, for example, doing all those kinds of things. And this is what they are particularly exercised about. The second, I suppose, international component of this is, of course, the closure of the American base. And we should remember how, dear to the hearts of the Americans their bases are. I mean, they're still in this country, even though Britain was an ally of them 70 years ago in the Second World War. They're still in Germany and Japan, who you might have thought after all this time wouldn't have to have American bases. They're all in the former Soviet Union republics, around Iran, around Afghanistan, around all these places. They are in many, many parts of the world, and they take it as practically an act of war for one of these things to be removed or closed down, which is why they very rarely are. And so those reasons are obviously very important. But I think there are other domestic reasons that it's so important as well, and I think that a number of speakers have touched on this, that, what what the American and the British and the other governments who at the moment are encouraging a sort of globalised austerity where they're forcing down the living standards of millions of people in every country where they can possibly do so. When they're doing this, it is a complete affront to them to look at anywhere where poverty might be beginning to be eradicated, or there's closing of the gap between rich and poor, to look at anywhere where there is a fair system of taxation, so the rich pay more or pay anything, as Robin has said, as it seems to be remarkable in this country that so many of them don't. It's an affront to them that education and health and all these things should be things that people have as of right. All of these things are things that they don't want to happen, and therefore I think we should see, and I always think this when we talk about wars, because Stop the War Coalition, we're obviously involved in campaigning over wars, against wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq, in attempts in Syria and Iran, and now of course in Africa we have wars in Mali and British troops going to Mali. We always think about these as kind of separate things. They're not separate things. We need to have some joined up thinking, because we should be absolutely aware that there is joined up thinking on the side of the imperialists and their allies. That is the simple truth of the matter. And it's about strategic control of the world. It's about the oil and gas in Algeria, or the uranium in Niger, or whatever the things that they're talking about, the oil in the whole of the Middle East, the oil in Latin America, all these different kind of things. But it's also about an economic system that they want to impose on the rest of us. And therefore, the austerity and wars go hand in hand. The economic crisis and wars go hand in hand, which is one reason why they're becoming more frequent, more widely spread geographically, and everything else. And therefore, it seems to me, when we talk about these questions, is that we should see them in a much more connected way. When you think what they have succeeded to a certain extent in achieving inside the European Union, one of the richest areas of the world, in Greece, what they've succeeded in doing in terms of cutting people's living standards and cutting their pensions and creating conditions where immigrants are attacked by ever-growing groups of fascists and all this kind of thing. When you think they are willing to do this in an area which certainly has the money to pay for a better standard of living for everybody, this is something that we are going to see time and time again. And it seems to me we have to look at I think we're facing in the 21st century some very serious questions. Do we want a world where inequality is growing? The headline of the Evening Standard tonight in one of the richest cities in the world, they drop house prices and the bedroom tax, where it's become a luxury to have a two-bedroom flat in this city, is driving ordinary people out of London. Are we going to live in a world where the poor get poorer, where even the people who aren't poor, but who aren't rich, are penalised more and more? When we have all these kind of things, and when we're told that if we don't accept this, we're faced with military coup and war and occupation and all the other things that people have been faced with, it seems to me we have to be looking at a different way of organising the world. And that means the ordinary people of the world organising the world and fighting to change the world in the ways that we think are important to benefit not just ourselves but future generations and the mass of ordinary people. It seems to me the stories that people have been describing tonight about Ecuador and a whole number of things we know about other parts of Latin America is there is an attempt going on to reorder some of these things. It's an attempt which in my view is going to have to go much further and will face real challenges on the path ahead. It isn't going, these people aren't going to necessarily give up their power and wealth and privilege, but they never do give it up easily if you look at our history. Nonetheless, it is absolutely important we campaign over these issues now, we show solidarity with the people of Latin America and fight for a very different sort of world. Thank you very much.
You should be glad that you're not my student anymore. This is a lie. But just to start from that point,